So there's basically three ways that you can estimate your carbon emissions for CBAM. The first is using what's called the EU default values. Now, for every kind of product that is produced and shipped into the EU, that's covered by CBAM, so that could be a screw, it could be rolled aluminium, it could be fertilizer. Every product has what's called a default emissions value, which is given by the EU per kilo of that product or per ton of that product. So basically, the idea is you can use this if you have absolutely nothing else. And actually, the EU is allowing companies, even within the active period of CBAM, to report up to 20% of their emissions using these default values. Now, the big problem with these default values is they are aimed to take the worst case scenario. So typically, the default values are taken from averaging out the emissions that are coming from the absolute worst performing sites for these products in the EU. So, for example, a lot of that is saying if it's steel, this is going to be the dirtiest, sort of most energy-intensive coal-fired steel blast furnaces that are taken in calculating these default values. So typically, they're a massive overestimate. And so if you just use the default values, you're going to be sort of reporting too much when it comes to emissions and probably having to pay too much. Now, once we get into the active period of CBAM, anyway, you can only use default values for 20% of your emissions. So you need to go one level deeper. And here, basically, it's about then getting the real emissions from your tier one supplier. So really the exporter giving you their real emissions from their facility. And then looking at the precursor product quantities. So say if you've got kilos of screws that are made out of steel and putting some kind of local emissions factor on. Right, so you might say, okay, Chinese steel in general has X amount of tons per kilo, and I'm sourcing my steel in China, so I'm going to use this for my precursor materials. Now, this is a bit better, but it still doesn't really allow you to have clarity on how carbon intensive your different suppliers are, right? Because you're applying one emissions factor for every supplier. What we recommend is to go deeper than that and really get very high quality data that we call on-site data. So this is really understanding not only the data from your suppliers' facilities, but really going and understanding the precursor suppliers' facility emissions as well, right? So if you've got a steel plant, really understanding, looking at their facility and understanding actually how they're using energy within their facility, and again using emissions factors for the materials that are more localized, right? So really not just saying sort of Chinese steel is going to have this, but saying, okay, steel produced in the Shanghai area based on the specific grid constraints of Shanghai is going to have this much, right? So really, really localizing this data as much as possible.